Joining this episode of Talk to Al Jazeera is the President of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
If we may talk about the situation in Zimbabwe, which of course you're playing a very important mediating role there. As you're aware, the opposition movement for democratic change is urging African leaders to put pressure on President Robert Mugabe to step down. What's your response to those demands?
Well, as you said correctly, I mean, we were asked by the Southern African Development Community to facilitate the discussions, dialogue between the ruling party and the opposition party in Zimbabwe, which we've been doing. And quite frankly, I mean, we have avoided discussing those processes publicly because we don't believe that it's correct to conduct negotiations through the media. So indeed, I mean, both parties will put all sorts of proposals to the facilitator. And the task of the facilitator in those circumstances is to convey the whatever the issues might be to the other side and let the sides engage one another. So whatever the issue is. So you'll pardon me because I can't conduct facilitation via the media.
Understood. I understand that you're in a very delicate position as a mediator. What if, I mean, you come to the point where quiet diplomacy, with all your good intentions and good efforts, doesn't seem to be appreciated by the two sides, and they're not responding. Is there a stage, another stage perhaps, do you think, that the world should move on to in trying to prevent a crisis engulfing the region?
Well, first of all, I honestly have never understood what is meant by quiet diplomacy. I don't know, you might be able to explain to me what is meant by that. Because all diplomacy is quiet. If it's not quiet, then it's not diplomacy, it's something else. I mean, what we've said about the situation in Zimbabwe for a long time is that the solution to the problems of Zimbabwe rests in the hands of the Zimbabwe people. It's not South Africa that's going to solve the problem of Zimbabwe, or indeed anybody else. It's got to be the Zimbabweans. And so what we've sought to do over many years is indeed to say that to the people of Zimbabwe, to the leaders of Zimbabwe, please get together, and to the extent that you want us to facilitate that, we're ready, and together identify the problems and say what needs to be done to solve the problems. And I'm quite convinced that remains the only correct way to go. You see, we shouldn't shift the task of defining what Zimbabwe should look like to foreigners. We would, as a South African, I refused that. We refused it during the course of our negotiations. We said we will negotiate the resolution of the South African problem because we knew if somebody else came and imposed a solution on us, it wouldn't last because it wouldn't be our solution. And the Zimbabwe question, the people who must find a solution are the people of Zimbabwe, the leaders of Zimbabwe. The rest of us must assist. In the context of the facilitation that we were asked to handle, which had to do with the political circumstances, trying to find a resolution to the political problems of Zimbabwe, indeed we said, can't we work together to create a situation in which the people of Zimbabwe elect a government of their choice? Which meant you had to help to create the conditions for free and fair elections so that the people of Zimbabwe can decide, not the people of South Africa. So the people of Zimbabwe could decide. And indeed, what's happened in these elections, I think everybody essentially agrees that what came out of the elections did indeed represent the will of the people of Zimbabwe. There might be a contest, a dispute about the presidential election result and so on. But basically, everybody said what you saw coming out in terms of the municipal elections, that was the will of the people of Zimbabwe. In terms of what came out in the context of the House of Assembly, the Senate, all of these, this reflected the will of the people of Zimbabwe, which I think is the correct thing to do. Not to say the solution to the problems of Zimbabwe resides elsewhere. It's in the hands of the people of Zimbabwe, has to be. But the people of Zimbabwe must have the choice, the possibility freely to decide what happens to their country.
Listening to you speak, Mr. President, do you feel that perhaps international powers are too involved in the affairs of Zimbabwe?
Well, we have appealed to everybody really on the basis of what I've just said. We've appealed to everybody to say, can we, all of us, please give the people of Zimbabwe enough space to solve their own problems. Because, I mean, if I stand up and I make some prescriptions about what I, as South African, want Zimbabwe to be, there will be a response from some Zimbabweans who will say, who do those South Africans think they are? And indeed, it's true of any other country.
So perhaps the rhetoric from London and Washington isn't helpful for the situation in Zimbabwe?
I think it would help if all of us sang one song, and that song was, let's give maximum space to the people of Zimbabwe to solve their problems. I think that would help.
Another suggestion that the upcoming presidential runoff, do you think it would be helpful if UN monitors were allowed in to monitor these elections? Do you think that would help calm the situation, instill trust in the process?
Well, you know that I'm an African. The African Union sent observers for these elections, as did the Southern African Development Community, as did other Africans. And I'm quite certain that as Africans were perfectly capable of monitoring properly, assessing properly, and indeed I'm sure you've seen the reports that have been issued, Pan-African Parliament and so on. We've made some critical remarks, for instance, about certain elements of those elections. So I don't like the idea that it is suggested that as Africans we cannot do this job. And therefore there must be some other people elsewhere because we are unreliable. On what basis is that said? I think people must really, I think we must, all of us, begin to respect the African people. If there were the Zimbabwe government invited observers from Asia, from Latin America, from Africa, from the Caribbean, the Russians. I don't know why it would be suggested that those observers are incompetent or dishonest or something. So the idea that we will not be able as Africans, never mind others, people from Asia, people from Latin America, all of those people can't do a proper job unless there is somebody else, as you mentioned, the United Nations. With the United Nations observers, as I understood from the Secretary General of the United Nations, observers of the UN are sent by virtue of resolutions taken by the General Assembly. So anybody who suggests that there should be UN observers, in terms of what the Secretary General of the UN told me, they would have to make a presentation to the General Assembly. And as far as I know, nobody has. So then the matter would be decided by the General Assembly as to whether it thinks there is such a need or there isn't. And I would imagine that the General Assembly would say, but our countries as African countries, our countries as Latin America, our countries as Asians, our countries as the Middle East, as the countries we were all invited. And I think that all of those people have the necessary competence to do with this job. But surely if anybody believes that there needs to be a UN observers, I'm sure they have the freedom to present the matter to the General Assembly.
You've been in office now for 2 periods, 2 terms. Has the post-apartheid transition process gone according to plan?
It's gone very well. I think given where we come from, and given the challenges that the country faced and the country continues to face, I think it's gone very well indeed in all major elements. Whereas people, for instance, feared that there would be a racial war, it hasn't happened. And whereas people thought that we were really faced with an impossible task with regard to the matter of national reconciliation and national unity. I think that the cohesion in South African society is much, much better than people expected. I think the quality of the lives of the people, as again, given where we come from, we're talking about 300 years, 350 years of colonialism and apartheid. I think in a short period that South Africa has been free, much progress has been made to change the lives of the people for the better. And of course, when we took power in '94, you know the nature of the relations between South Africa and the African continent, and indeed the rest of the world. And I think what's happened in the last 14 years to place South Africa as a normal citizen of the world, I think great progress has been made. So I think in all major respects, indeed, yes, I think the transition has gone well.